Good afternoon, everyone. I hope you've had a good stretch and a fantastic meal during lunch. We have many exciting panels coming up. So just some reminders before we begin. Please make sure your mask is worn at all times except when eating or drinking during meal times. We'll be trying to address as many questions as we can to the speakers during this panel. And for the questions that we can't get to, we hope to cover them in future articles. So keep them coming. For those of you in person, there are QR codes on the site that you can use to log into Slido and select track 1. For those of you tuning in virtually, feel free to send your questions over through the chat box, and our moderators will share them with our panelists. So for the next hour, I'll be moderating Untangling the Supply Chain. This panel will cover how government agencies are upgrading the supply chain and developing more resilient, efficient, and secure supply chains. So today's session will begin with a 10-minute presentation by Mr. Kenneth Lim, Assistant Chief Executive Industry at Maritime Port Authority of Singapore, or MPA, on how Singapore is optimizing its supply chain. Kenneth, please.
Thank you very much. Okay. Let me attempt to give a quick context settings before our discussion, and I know I have 10 minutes. All right, so just want to give everyone here a glimpse in terms of some of the statistics of our port. Singapore runs one of the busiest transshipment hubs. So if you know, maybe 20% of the cargo is from import and export locally. But the rest of the 80% actually are connecting to the rest of the world, right? Because they need to transship through Singapore. And why? Because it is along the Straits of Malacca. It is a good geographical location between the east and the west. And therefore, a lot of ships call onto PSA, offload their containers, then take on more containers, and they go on to their various routes, whether to Africa, to Europe, to China, North Asia. So there are many. So Singapore is one of the transshipment hub, busiest transshipment hub. We also a bunkering hub. So when they call on Singapore, a ship do the cargo discharging, loading, unloading, but at the same time they take on supply, they take on the crew, they take on water, they take on the fuel. So this is a place in which many of the ships do that. Why I said this context? Because in terms of what happened globally, is also affecting Singapore. And Singapore also needs to play our part to support the whole global supply chain. And some of the global trends I will list down here, and I'm sure these are common trends that you see that affects across multiple sectors, right? And specifically for this panel discussion, the supply chain congestion. Last year, you heard about the Suez Canal congestion. You know, you see this small little tow truck that actually tried to dig the evergreen vessel out of the Suez Canal. That really kind of raised the whole awareness of shipping in the global arena. And then, of course, you have other geopolitical development. You got evolving market shares and all that. I think what comes down to it is about whether the global supply chain in terms of food, energy, and people are being done properly. And you can, last year, you can start to see when we have congestions in some of the ports, you start to see cargo getting delayed, right? And therefore, the topic for this afternoon was very important on untangling the supply chain congestion. So to start off, I would say during COVID, what needs to happen is that Singapore make a stand in terms of the government is to let the port remain open, right? It is an important stand because the goods needs to flow, right? The goods needs to flow. Imagine we have the consideration of public health at that time. We were worried whether the crew on board the vessels, will they infect the people? And then at some stage, we were worried whether our people locally would affect the seafarers on board the vessels. This is a balance act that we need to do. The port itself has to make sure that the workers have all the hygiene factors, contactless operation, how the key crane, all the discharging, loading, all needs to be contactless. This is an important aspect. And we saw if a country don't handle this properly, you will have port shutdown. And when the port shut down, vessels are being delayed. They are waiting at the port, waiting to take empty containers or to discharge the containers. We have seen this all in the newspaper. So what Singapore has done is to remain open in the midst of COVID. So we have, in fact, allowed all vessels to come in. We allow containers to be discharged and loaded. In fact, we also facilitated more than 250,000 of seafarers coming through Singapore to be changed on board the vessels. Right? On the right-hand side is all the relief measures and all that we actually also support the community to get the whole supply chain going, resilient, so that they can continue to operate. So to build up this supply chain resiliency, I think it's important. In the last 2 years, we actually see even greater push and support for digitalization, right? A lot of contactless, a lot of, we talk about the data sharing or, going advance notice about when you are coming so that we can prepare all the various stuff. I think those are important aspects. So whether it is the whole supply chain within Singapore, you see from NTUC and all the various agencies working hand in hand to make sure that all our food supply, or toilet papers, I don't know why, but these are still important element and essential goods, right? Okay, and to do that, I think, we talk about a digital port. So what we have done, even in the midst of COVID, is to cut down all the red tapes, streamline the processes, allow the vessel to do a one-stop call so then we can do all the various back-end to clear with other agencies, whether it's ICA, whether it's NEA, we clear on behalf of the vessels, right? And when we talk about digitalization, I'm sure you all hear enough. It's about data standards, data sharing. In the case of maritime, this is where we actually advocate the use of APIs, to do service call across, not only within Singapore, but we actually advocate to other ports as well, so that the shipping lines, whether you are MERS, whether CMA, CGM, whether Evergreen, when they do a port call, they can use the same API to do the port call with the rest. And, port are just providing connectivity, so we need to provide that. The API gateway is marketplace really is to aggregate all the various type of APIs for the vessels and for the maritime and shipping industry. So I think that's just to give you a glimpse of that. Within the national initiatives, the last 2 years, there's also a private industry initiative called the SG TradeX, which allows the various stakeholders and the value chain partners to come together. One of the initiatives that is shared across was the banks and the traders on bill of ladings. There's also a value chain that is on bunkering, giving data of bunkering to the bank so the bank can actually finance a bunker. If we drive a car, we know we go to a petrol station, we know bunker, bunker as in pumping the petrol maybe costs us $100. But to a vessel, actually it costs is about 40% of the operating costs. So it is a very big item, All right, so, and when we talk about digitalization, of course, I think cybersecurity always is a concern. So working together with the Shipping Association, with the Institutes of Higher Learning, it is all about strengthening the posture of our maritime in terms of port, whether it's ships, whether it is MPA, which we are guarding the anchorages spaces. And this, I think, is important because, as I said, shipping is an international business. Supply chain is an international business. We can't just do alone. If Singapore is the best in class, it doesn't matter because supply chain will still be congested. So you need to work with other ports, partners, to make sure that the whole supply chain is as seamless as possible. And therefore, we actually kind of advocate a lot of initiative with other port authorities to advocate digitalization. Right. And sustainability has, in the last 2 years, become a very strong topic. We talk about the use of fuel, optimizing the data efficient use of the routing of voyages. I think this is the same for supply chain. It is important that supply chain now takes on a new perspective on sustainability. So in summary, I just want to just set the context of digitalizing is strengthening the supply chain resiliency. There are few aspects. I'm sure there will be many more factors that are required to build up the resiliency, which we will discuss later on. It is important to have a tripartite approach because a lot of ports actually have unions, workers working, and therefore union, association, industry, government really need to come together to work as one. In fact, we also have an international advisory panel. We get different stakeholders, shippers, from, and tech providers, and many of them to advise Singapore how we could play our part in the whole supply chain. And these are the three takeaways. First, the supply chain reconfiguration using technology. Two, Maritime Hub can play a bigger role in terms of connected. So we are now working with some of the overseas ports to do digital corridors and green corridors. And that is the third takeaway. With that, I have 5 seconds, and I want to set the context here. And thank you very much, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that presentation, Kenneth. I'd like to invite our panelists on stage. Give me a moment. So today's panelists include Mr. Peter Kemp, New Zealand Deputy High Commissioner to Singapore, as well as Dr. Wang Wei, Technical Division Director, Smart Manufacturing, Advanced Remanufacturing and Technology Center from A-Star, as well as Mr. Kenneth Lim, who you've just met. So may I invite you all to take the stage? Thank you. Right, throughout the panel, attendees may feel free to ask questions through the Q&A chat box on Slido with the event code FOI 2022 under track 1. Later on, we'll also share the QR code on the screen above, and we'll be flashing it during the panel as well. For virtual attendees, you can also post your question at our chat box in the platform you are viewing now. So first off, I'd like to start off by asking the panelists, what are some of the recent incidents that have demonstrated the need for a resilient supply chain? I know Kenneth mentioned the Suez Canal incident earlier. I'm curious to hear what are some of the incidents that are fresh in your minds, and what are some of the lessons you maybe gleaned from that? So maybe we can go around and share one key incident of note. Peter, would you like to start?
One incident which is fresh in my mind is I like chicken rice. So the absence of fresh chicken for a little bit was a big concern. But certainly I know out of this situation there's discussion in Singapore about people having a different mindset in terms of the food they eat. So maybe if you have a preference for fresh chicken, maybe being prepared to eat something plant-based or another type of food. So in terms of the supply chain, part is also a mindset in terms of different alternatives, people being prepared maybe to have different choices.
Dr. Wang?
Okay, I think supply chain resilience, this is a very important topic. In the past maybe 20, 30 years or even longer period, many business, they have been very focusing on minimizing the cost, reducing inventory or increasing the asset utilization. But many companies actually were unprepared for the short wave of the global crisis. And I remember just not long ago, maybe last December, there was a flood in Malaysia, and one of the largest port was affected. And this port, if I don't remember wrongly, I think it should be the second largest in Southeast Asia. And exports all these semiconductor industries nearby. And one of the chip company was affected, and they lose the business, maybe 20, 30 million US dollar. But this is not just end of story, because they are also the supplier for many electronic makers all over the world. And at the end, all these companies were affected, even though their factories are quite away from Malaysia. And the next part of the story is this also contribute to the global chip shortage last year and affect quite a few automotive production, some in US or in China. So I think this is just one example of supply chain disruption due to climate change. Not to mention, those massive disruption, supply chain disruption due to COVID-19, which is still impacting our global supply chain. Yeah.
How about yourself, Kenneth?
Well, besides the Suez Canal, right, I think like doctor mentioned, the COVID lockdown actually is very vivid in my mind because that actually translate to a lot of volume of containers that needs to pass through there, to pass through Singapore. The other one was, recently we talked about Sri Lanka. The onions actually are also stuck because of the flow of goods of onions. Just imagine onions in the containers and how are they going to be fermented and then grow. So there are many, many examples. I think even in the Russia-Ukraine tension, at the Black Sea, again, that is another stark reminder of us in terms of at the Black Sea port, how mines are being put and vessels couldn't leave the port. And there is also involvement of seafarers. So I think these are very stark reminders for us that actually we need to make sure that the supply chain, at least in the sea space, is very essential. Yeah.
Thanks for that. I think the examples everyone has shared so far really points to the fact that the supply chain is not somewhere out there. It's something that affects us in our everyday lives as well. Like the chicken rice example or onions, right? These are things that we deal with every day. So thank you for that. And that's next, I'd like to ask then, ask each of you about some of the current challenges that countries face when it comes to creating a responsive, resilient, and secure supply chain. So building off your presentation, Kenneth, what are some of the factors that you foresee will pose a threat to supply chains in the coming years? And how does MPA plan to strengthen Singapore's position against these threats?
Okay, maybe I'll just give 3 areas, and of course there could be more. The first area definitely has to be infrastructure, right? So if you don't have the capacity to handle, then there is really a bottleneck. So which is why I think the government really planned in her heads. The Tuas port is in the development stage. In fact, first few berths are already starting to operationalize. Tuas port at the Tuas site is going to be the largest consolidated container terminal. Okay, last year, just to give you a sense, last year, the whole of Singapore, we did the best record, 37.2 million TEUs of handling. Tuas port is going to be 65 million TEUs capacity, double the size. And if you see that, likewise for air aviation, right? We have also doubling our aviation capacity, sea, and because sea, air, these are all important infrastructure. So infrastructure capacity is important. If you have infrastructure, but you don't have the technology, then that is going to be a next factor that is going to affect many countries and different ports. So we're going to invest a lot in terms of technologies, whether it is in the research, robotic hands to do coning, deconing, lashing. We're going to have automated prime movers, autonomous trucks and all that, CCTVs, IoTs. These are all technologies that actually, it is amazing to see how PSA deploys so many technologies within a port, right? Also, you have the Jurong port, who is looking at the gateway part of it. If you have infrastructure and you have automation, technologies and all that, the third pillar is really about the talent. If you have all this, but you don't have the skilled workforce, then there is nothing to talk about as well. So I think these are the 3 elements. And in the area of talent development, I think there's a lot of talks about developing. So we put in schemes and incentives to promote the use of technology, teach our workforce to be skilled in literacy, digital literacy, in using simulation and optimization technology to plan for their port's operation as well.
Thanks for that, Kenneth. And I know Dr. Wang works on kind of technology that supports supply chain management. And I'm curious, Dr. Wang, what are some of the inefficiencies and the disruptions that supply chain, particularly supply chain tech, has to manage?
Okay. I think when we come to this topic, responsive, resilient, and secure supply chain, we can think about many approaches which may have been taught in business school. For example, build the redundancy, multi-sourcing, or diversified supplies. There are many things, but actually every approach has a side effect. When we build redundancy on manufacturing capacity or put our inventory at a higher level, the cost increases. If we try to diversify supplies or pursue multi-sourcing, our supply chain network become more and more complex. So actually the question of change here is, how can we do all this in a more efficient, more effective, and more precise way? So my thinking is the change, the answer is with Industry 4.0. Also, like what Kenneth mentioned, one of the pillar, the technology pillar. So how can we harness the power from Industry 4.0 to build in resilience, responsiveness, and security into supply chain management? I think this is important. Maybe I can share one example. This is related to supply chain early risk detection. In late December 2019, one of our technology partners, they have business in China, and they use a natural language processing (NLP) technique to pick up local reports of certain phenomenon-like illness in a moment. And in the first week of January 2020, they sent out the first alert to their customer and put together pandemic readiness assessment for more than 1,000 suppliers across the entire province in China and gauge the impact. This happened in January 2020. And this gives their customer some time to adjust the operation. This also increase their supply chain resilience. So just coming back to your question, in efficiency and disruption, this is always part of the journey of supply chain management. They could happen anywhere, they could happen anytime. But the key is how can we make good use of technology to deal with that?
Thanks for that. And maybe Peter, for you, what are some of the key challenges facing global trade from your perspective?
Thank you. I think Kenneth, at the start of his presentation, mentioned some of these, and there are quite a few, from Russia's invasion of Ukraine to inflation, of course, COVID. I'll try not to be too downbeat. But I think, like you mentioned here, with these challenges, there's also opportunities, and how do we use technology to move forward? And also from a policy perspective, as a bureaucrat, how do we continue to keep faith and promote free trade, open supply chains? I mean, free trade has delivered amazing amounts for the global economy in recent decades. And certainly any move towards greater protectionism or trying to move away, how do we make sure that we keep the faith? We want trade which delivers for everybody, but we want to make sure we believe this has worked or will continue to work, and we can use technology and to overcome some of the challenges we face now into coming decades.
Thanks for that. So we've heard a little bit about some of the challenges and some of the situations that have brought these challenges to light. I'd like to move on to learn about some of the initiatives that your teams are working on to help support the supply chain becoming more resilient, more responsive, and more secure. So perhaps, Kenneth, how does optimizing maritime and port operations help to promote resilience in Singapore's supply chains? And what are the key initiatives that you might want to share about how MPA contributes to this? Yep.
Thanks. I will start off to say, riding on the Tuas port, one of the biggest investment we put in is actually to set up a center for next generation port in NUS, right? To leverage on their capabilities on simulation and optimization. Because when you have a green field of land, then you start to really have that flexibility to see how do you design the next generation port. Should it be horizontal, vertical? Should it be double-storied, on under deck, over deck? So there are many of such consideration or design consideration when you want to design the next generation port. And I think the use of optimization and simulation capability is important. And when you use simulation, you need to simulate how the various containers are being offloaded, loaded on them, and the number of workers, number of equipment being used. It is a very complex, because in front of the doctor I must use the right word, a complex problem that you need to solve simultaneously. And within a period of time such that it can be delivered to the workers working in shift. Because even if you can have all the capability to generate, but if it is beyond the execution time, then there's no value to that as well. So that is in terms of designing the port. And when you then start to operate the port, what we are now using is what we call the just-in-time kind of a concept, where we allow the vessels to actually indicate the time in which they are arriving at the port and orchestrate the rest of the maritime services that will support the vessels. So when they want to come to the anchorage, what time does the pilot will board the vessels to bring the vessels into, and then when do you do the discharging of containers, berthing them, and then when do you get the ship supply to offer the supply and also the bunkering or the fuel. This itself is also using a lot of technology and optimization because you have to involve a lot of the stakeholders. And with that, it's all about, we talk about the timing, the chronological order of timing of the various activities. Because some activity, because of safety reasons, you don't want to happen at the same time. Then when they want to leave, actually the whole anchorage, you know that the Singapore, when you go to West Coast, East Coast, you see all the vessels out there. It's not because they are congested. It's because they are waiting there to do their ship supply or bunkering and all that. At any point in time, there's about 1,000 vessels out there at the anchorages. So where do they berth and where are they positioned in the anchorage is itself a problem to optimize and to schedule as well. So this whole port, water safety, navigation safety, is all about using technology to solve some of these capabilities. Yeah.
Thanks for that. Perhaps, Peter, I'd like to hear about how Singapore and New Zealand are working together to strengthen the supply chain through the New Zealand-Singapore Supply Chain Working Group.
Sure. I must say, it still was very early days in the supply chain working group, so we're just at the start of the process of working through how we're going to work together. I think for me at this stage, there's a couple of things. One is, I think I've said here, the complexity in some of these supply chains and helping to bring together some of our stakeholders so they understand both the complexity and the opportunities, as well as with the changes around technology. I think sometimes you may not be aware of what might be possible. So part of it might be just an old-fashioned thing of getting the right people in the room, perhaps like this event here. I think there is something in the data exchange space. Certainly as government, we want to try to create framework or doorways to help enable that, but also recognise a lot of this is private sector businesses. So how do you encourage those companies to come together and share data on platforms? So it's complex, but I think the opportunity for countries like Singapore, New Zealand is a scale. We can pilot things, we can show a way forward, what can work. So that is where we can bring real value, show a way forward where other people can come and as a model and follow in behind.
Thanks for that, Peter. I know, Dr. Wang, earlier you mentioned Industry 4.0. I'm curious, could you share a bit more about ARTC's Supply Chain 4.0 initiative?
Yeah, sure. I think Supply Chain 4.0 is one of the key initiatives in A-Star, focusing on digital and automation innovation to build a responsive, resilient, and secure supply chain in Singapore. With total investment of over 18 million in 2 years, this initiative is led by A-Star together with the other 2 research partners, the National University of NUS, National University of Singapore, and the Singapore University of Technology and Design (SUTD). So the reason why we initiate this program is very simple. Because in the past 2 decades, we have observed very rapid progress of many emerging technologies, from robotics artificial intelligence, additive manufacturing, quantum computing, the Internet of Things, IoT. So supply chain 4.0 is to leverage all these technology advancement to improve the supply chain performance and efficiency, and ultimately customer satisfaction. So this program has attracted more than 50 companies from 5 industry sectors: aerospace, FMCG, fast-moving consumer goods, precision engineering, semiconductor, and semiconductor and pharmaceutical, including MNC and SME. So in this program, we already collect a lot of problem statements and common pain points from our industry partner. So our researchers will co-create the solution with our industry partner, such as software solution provider, logistic company, system integrator, or retailer. So using Industry 4.0 technology, they are mainly focusing, our researchers, they are mainly focusing on 3 main areas: digital value chain, data-driven optimization, smart warehouse automation. So we believe all these solutions developed by this Supply Chain 4.0 program will help companies to gain better supply chain visibility, better manage interaction, and further improve their operation efficiencies.
Thanks for that. I think that's a great time. It's a great time to bring up SG TradeX. So Kenneth, I'd like to hear, how does MPA encourage the adoption of such digital tools like SG TradeX, and how does SG TradeX promote collaboration in the supply chain ecosystem?
All right, SG TradeX, as a part of the COVID period, Deputy Prime Minister Heng Swee Keat actually started this Emerging Stronger Task Force. And in that, there are many great initiatives that come out, led largely by private sector. So SG TradeX is actually one such example in which they feel that in the whole value chain, if you could actually bring stakeholders together and provide a data highway for sharing of data, then it might improve the overall supply chain visibility and, of course, therefore helping to elevate the productivity. The key to bring this to fruition is the stakeholders. Who do you bring on board? So what SG TradeX has done is to bring on board the banks, the financial institutions, the logistic players, the cargo owners, of course, the depots, and even shipping lines, right? So with this value chain, then they bring a lot of stakeholders together through workshop to identify what are really the pain points that are faced in the industry and the use of data to alleviate some of these problems. So some examples will be the banks will be looking at the bill of lading. How do they make sure that this bill of lading do not duplicate and to be making sure that it is authenticated, right? So there's between the shipping lines, the cargo owners, and the banks, how do they do that, right? The other use case that they have identified is how do the trucks go to the containers, go to the depot, and how do they actually track all these container depots, container movement? So there's another use case. The one that we are involved as far as MPA is concerned and support is really on the bunkering side. How do you do electronic bunker delivery note or e-bunkering such that you can actually automate some of the bunkering operation on vessels? So these have been, so when they launched in June this year, actually these 3 use cases went live, right? Now the next wave of challenges comes into identifying new cases. So one of the new use cases is about ship supply optimization. So when the vessels call on the different, it's just very much like land transport, you can actually go to pack everything into a truck and then you ship it out to your customer. But for vessels who are at the whole of the anchorage space, how do you get the various boats or drones or things like that to bring the ship supply to the vessels. So they wanted to optimize this ship supply, and it's led by Jurong Port and many of the stakeholders involved as well. So SG TradeX, I kind of like it because it's really industry-led type of initiative to bring stakeholders together, talking about data standards, not storing data, but essential data, some of these key things that actually they discuss. Thanks.
Thanks for that. And maybe just quickly building off what you were saying, and this is open to all the panelists, maybe what are some of the challenges that may come, or what are some of the hesitation that industry might face in terms of data sharing? Given that you're saying that there is this kind of tension, maybe you could speak a bit more about that if you want to. Or if anyone wants to take that question, yeah.
Maybe I can share some of my personal opinion regarding on the data sharing. Because we're in ARDC, when we run this supply chain 4.0, we deal with many industry partners, industry business owners. To some extent, if we are going to promote data sharing, we need to set up a very good mechanism. I think SG TradeX, this is already a very good first step. But after that, how are we going to set up a proper data architecture and data management prototype, so that our business owner, they have the feeling that they don't have to compromise with their confidential information, and they can benefit from the data sharing. I think this is very, very important for business owner. SG TradeX already create a platform for private and partnership communication and collaboration. I think this is a very good step.
Thanks for that. And maybe building on what you just shared, what are some of the tech tools, whether related to data or not, that ARTC is supporting to help further future-proof the supply chain?
Okay, I'd like to talk about technology. I'm a strong believer on digital twin and its application in supply chain. If we do it properly, digital twin could be the virtual representation of the entire supply chain. And we can do many things on supply chain planning, improvement, optimization, or further development from there. When we're talking about digital twin, there could be a multiple layer of digital twin, a different architecture. But generally speaking, it always starts from the acquisition layer, where we have to use the IoT technology to build up the connectivity of supply chain, and hence we can gain the full visibility for the supply chain. And this is always the foundation for any supply chain improvement. And after this acquisition layer, there may be a representation layer. That means at this layer, we need to understand the interdependency of different supply chain nodes and try to understand their respective key performance indicator. And from there, this can help us to create a knowledge graph, or could create a very complex supply chain network diagram. Then once you have the representation layer ready, you can move to the next layer of analytics or optimization, where we can use different machine learning or AI algorithm to do supply chain planning, network simulation, demand forecasting, or prediction on the disruption, etc. I can share one example here. Quite a few years ago, we developed one dynamic simulation model for one FMCG company for them to design and optimize their regional supply chain network with certain focus on the number and location of their distribution center and warehouses, and the fleet size of their delivery vehicle with proper finance consideration. That means they can use this platform, this model, to do various scenario planning, including different market situation or different business scale, or maybe certain type of supply disruption. And so this is how a company can benefit from digital twin. And usually the top layer of the digital twin will be the visualization, because we shouldn't forget about those business owners, the top leadership in the company. They need to get very essential information and make quick decisions. So usually there will be the visualization layer. So if you ask me which technology, definitely I would say digital twin will be one of the key technology to help us to future-proof the supply chain.
Thank you for that. I think that's really helpful. And I agree that digital twin simulation tech will be really important to help optimize the supply chain. And finally, for this section, Peter, what are some of the digital tools, some of the strategies that New Zealand is implementing to strengthen its supply chain? This can be tech, it need not be tech.
Yeah, I think there's a couple of different angles. But one, I guess, is at a bigger level is for economic agreements, having digital frameworks to help enable the type of initiatives which have been discussed here, to give businesses the confidence to exchange data, to engage, to have rules of the game. So one thing which we have in place is a digital economic partnership arrangement between New Zealand, Singapore and Chile, which attempts to provide the framework for how private sector and governments can work together to exchange information, digital information, and kind of the functioning of the digital economy. So I think in terms of, as government, it's really important we have these bigger frameworks in place to enable action by all the stakeholders.
And I think the World Trade Organization has recently shared about the rise of protectionism, and I'm curious, what are your thoughts on that? How would that impact these kinds of partnerships?
I think anything which impedes the free flow of goods, knowledge, data is potentially corrosive in terms of economic growth and trade. And obviously we want, I think, speaking personally, a trading network which benefits everyone. I think free trade does deliver, but we've got to make sure it does deliver for all members of society. So the question is how we work together to achieve that. But I think moving towards protectionism or I think it's all in interest to keep things open and flowing. It's not challenging given the number of issues on the horizon at the moment, let alone climate change, where again, we've got to have a joined up approach to resolving it. So how do you keep the openness and space and dialogue to do that is a key thing. Then it's going to be hard work, I think. You have to keep engaging and find ways to have that dialogue and I guess see the common benefit of some of these issues that ultimately we're going to be able to overcome supply chain or climate change by working together.
Thanks for that. Before we move on to the Q&A, maybe one question, a general question I'll pose to the floor. I'd like to ask each of you, what should this ideal supply chain look like? What are the key values, or how would you balance the different priorities? Let's say resilience versus efficiency. What is that ideal balance to you? What should the ideal supply chain look like? I know it's a broad one. Feel free to take it however you want. Maybe Kenneth first.
Well, I think supply chain at the end of the day is when the goods that we need arrive at the right time for us, right? I think that's the key characteristic of supply chain. And supply chain evolves as situation evolves. So if it is because of pandemic, we see that the resiliency become more important, right? Because you got your supply hub down, and therefore you need redundancies and all that. But when places are all full availability, then speed and efficiency become the next element that characterize the supply chain. So supply chain is so interesting and exciting because it evolves over time, it evolves over situation, and which is why all the supply chain logisticians always have a job to do because they feel the pulse of the world and they adapt it accordingly.
That's really insightful. Thank you for that. How about you, Dr. Wang?
I totally agree with Kenneth. I think there are many elements in supply chain. People may talk about responsiveness, efficiency, or whatever, but supply chain resilience definitely is the most essential, most critical way. But when we're talking about supply chain resilience, we also need to understand that it may have different definition or different meaning when we talk about that at the national level or company level. So at the national level, usually supply chain resilience may refer to one company's strategic ability to maintain and improve the supply security and efficiency of those essential goods, and how to manage the risk with heterogeneous ecosystems and geopolitical partners. So I think this is the national level. This is very important for Singapore. Then at the company level, supply chain resilience is one company's ability to react to the disruption, to the problem, and the ability to recover from them without any significant impact of compromising customers' timeline. I think this is for the company level. And there are I can't list out everything, but one thing we need to highlight, supply chain resilience is not just a one-off effort. I think during the COVID, people realized the importance of supply chain resilience, but those disruption that is happening today is not the first one, and will never be the last one. So supply chain resilience is conscious, continuous, and creative effort.
Very well put. Yourself? How about yourself, Peter?
I thought those are very, very good answers. It's a funny subject. If you asked me 3 years ago about supply chains, I would have had no idea because just things happened and goods turned up, and I got my chicken rice and I was happy. But I think you're right that these are really complex systems. There's also different factors, and depends what level you talk about, government or business. I guess one thing for me is part of it is to also be looking ahead. There's always a risk of some of these events. You have an event and you prepare for the next one by fighting the last war, or you get too focused on one area. So you've got to be very aware of what level you're talking about, the different dynamics, including, I guess, when you look right out, I guess at the moment into the future, climate change and sustainability has to be weaved in. You wouldn't want to say now because of cost increases and supply chain issues will put off climate change action for a bit. Clearly that's something which needs to be taken into account as well, but again, these are very complex systems, so you need to be very careful what you talk about, what level, who's involved. It's just not simple.
And I think it's really promising that Kenneth mentioned the kind of sustainability efforts happening in Singapore's own supply chain management. And I think you're absolutely right that climate change is one of those things supply chain will have to take into account. So thank you for that. Yes, and I think now it's the perfect time to move on to our Q&A. Please feel free to use the QR code on the screen to submit your questions. We do have a few questions here already. So let me start by sharing. One question that I think is pretty interesting is, how will geopolitical threats add to the complexity of the global supply chains? And how does MPA anticipate these threats and prepare for these eventualities?
Indeed, all this geopolitical situation around the world shown that, like I mentioned in the Black Sea there, how the ports are being, if you have no tugboats in a port, you can't actually pull out big vessels, So a very simple fact about such essential maritime services that needs to be in place. So for us, MPA, I think, instead of saying that anticipating these threats, we kind of make sure that we lay down some basic principles in terms of how we're going to operate in the dynamic world such as this. And one of the things that we if you see, is that we continue to make sure that the ports remains open, right? The ports must always remain open. Is always our core principle. You need to let the flow of goods happen. Of course, the type of goods you can control, right? You don't want weapons and all that, but essential goods and all that needs to flow. And therefore, I think that is always a position that I think we will always improve and make sure that the supply chain are not obstructed, unnecessarily.
Any thoughts on this question, Peter?
It's a very good question. At a government level, New Zealand, a bit like Singapore, we're always going to advocate for free trade, for essential supply goods to flow. Certainly in the early days of COVID, we came out with a statement with Singapore encouraging essential goods to remain open and these links to continue to operate. So certainly at a government level, we are and will continue to advocate for the rules of the game, international law to function, to states to act in the right way. And I think it's really important to remember that at all states, including smaller states, you have agency. So I think advocate, prepare, engage, continue to have dialogue, to prepare for, of course, what happens in the future is always hard to say. There always will be surprises, but we'll continue to push for the rules to be applied in the right way, so everyone knows what's going to happen, it's consistent, and private sector can operate in a space where it's what's going to happen.
Thanks for that. I guess the next question is, how do you view just-in-time versus just-in-case models when it comes to the supply chain? Do you think the pandemic actually chipped away progress made in efficiency? Perhaps Dr. Wang, I don't know if you'd like to speak on this.
Yeah, I think just in time, this is quite a traditional way of prepare the inventory. I think COVID-19 and the recent incident is also related to supply chain disruption already let us know every industry need to prepare their strategy and build out their strategy towards supply chain resilience. So to some extent, but if we totally threw away just-in-time strategy, we have to compromise with the efficiency. So this comes back to what I mentioned just now. If we build up a very good technical foundation, try to understand all the affecting factors. That the other question, that geopolitical threats, this is also another factor. I'm a technical person. I answer from technical perspective. To me, all the uncertainty in the supply, all the uncertainty in the geopolitical situation is just one of the factors in our model. So once we take all this into the consideration, the model can help us to have better prediction what's going to happen and how can we better prepare for that. But we need to find a balance between just in time and just in case strategy moving forward.
Thanks for that. Perhaps, Kenneth, would you like to speak on this question? How did the pandemic affect efficiency and just-in-time versus just-in-case?
Yeah, and during the last 2 years of COVID, actually our port, as I said, continued to accept the vessel call. So, in fact, actually it is very overloading, in terms of because you have to schedule and take in all the variables, we don't really turn away any vessels. So what we therefore need to have is the capacity to increase. So, we used to have Tanjong Pagar terminal, in which we actually decant, right? Which they moved to Pasir Panjang. During the last 2 years, actually we did open up a bit more into Keppel and Tanjong Pagar because of the vessels that are calling on Singapore. And the containers, you need the yard space, and you also bring in the additional workers to open up. And for Tuas Port, even though we haven't commissioned, really the operational, we already start putting the containers over at the Tuas Port as well. So I think whether it's just in time or just in case, I think that capacity to be flexible and agile is an important element. Even if it is a small country like Singapore, we must play our role of how to support the global supply chain. And those efforts that we do actually are appreciated a lot by the shipping lines, the shippers, because they know that many of these cargoes and all that needs to reach to the various destinations. Yeah.
Thank you for that. Oh, would you like to say anything, Peter? Go for it.
I mean, again, those answers were right on the mark, I thought. I guess I'm not sure whether I said, like my panelist said, in terms of one or the other, it's a dynamic system and there's a balance. And also it's hard to say in the moment, we probably need to be 10 or 20 years in the future to really know. I suppose these things are a bit like a pendulum, you might have some movement, things swing back. But definitely I don't think it's a case of just one or the other, or you'll go one hard way, one way, or back. So it's dynamic.
Thanks for that. And I guess our next and right now final Q&A question is, what are the initiatives that have been taken to manage costs while ensuring the supply chain remains uninterrupted? Would Kenneth or Peter want to speak on this?
The most, I think we can see that the market dynamics needs to kick in. The market play needs to kick in, right? Very much like what Peter talked about, the chicken supply. It is a question of whether should you cap the price of chicken, and because of that, we don't have live chicken to eat, right? It is, do you leave it to the market, but you provide the capacity to operate? I think that's the operating model that we are basing on. And therefore, you see in the last 2 years, actually freight rates did increase. And the freight rates increase is a reflection of the amount of goods that needs to supply and the amount of vessels that are in the market. If you artificially to cap it, I'm not sure how it will impact. But what we would have done is we actually encourage a lot of our shipping companies and our maritime service providers to go onto a digitalization journey to prepare themselves so that they can gain the efficiency, and by gaining efficiency, they can gain a bigger market share. I think those are the interventions that we will help our companies with. Yeah. Peter, yeah.
I agree. I guess, each country makes its own decisions. I guess New Zealand, as a country and economy, as a government, doesn't typically intervene that much in terms of subsidising or very much believe in leaving the market to itself to manage some of these pressures. And I think if you get into subsidising, you can distort things or have unintended consequences. So, again, there's opportunity here to find efficiencies or find ways to adjust to the circumstance. I think you just have to think very carefully if you're in the space of subsidising or trying to cap costs.
Maybe I may not answer this question directly, but maybe we'll just try to come from the other angle. When we take actions, try to improve our supply chain to make it more responsive, resilient, do we see it as a cost or do we see it as an investment? So for the time being, when, for example, you try to invest on a supply chain control tower, you may see it as a one-off CapEx or OpEx investment. But if this supply chain control tower can help us to gain better visibility and protect the supply chain from the disruption in the next run, you have to see it as an investment. So I don't have a very strict answer to this question, but different business, from my observation, different business definitely take different approach and different perspective.
Thanks for that. We still have a few minutes left, and we're out of Q&A questions. So I have one final question I'd like to ask each of you. As our audience leaves this panel today, if they had to remember one key technological innovation, one key tech tool that will define the supply chain digitalization, what would that be and why? So this is a question for each of you. One key digital tool, one key tech tool for our audience to take away from this session. Anyone can go first.
I'll start it off, and I think I'll leave the technology to my colleagues who are probably better placed. But maybe coming back to what I said at the start, actually, mindset will be key into the future, I think, particularly around, say, food or other items, probably in terms of being prepared maybe to have or accept other choices or things maybe at the moment you wouldn't think about buying or purchasing, maybe more open to different choices. So I think mindset alongside the technology is going to play quite an important role in the future. It's how we think and how we approach things in terms of what we go to purchase in the market.
So would you say an open mindset?
I think an open mindset, and again with climate change and things are going to change. We may have to be prepared to live slightly different ways or buy certain different things, or be prepared to adjust if there's another crisis. So I think part of it is a psychological process. But although technology is very important, I'm sure we'll hear some very good points here.
Thank you for that, Peter.
Yeah, I think if we're talking about technology, I have to repeat myself on the digital twin. As I mentioned, I'm a strong believer on digital twin. And digital twin is very complex. There's AI, there's machine learning, there's IoT, everything inside. But this is a very powerful tool, one powerful technology that we can make good use to protect our supply chain moving forward.
And for me, I think looking at the theme for this is Festival of Innovation. I think it's important that audience here who are actually also coming in here, who are interested to find out about technology, innovation, and many of these, is to go back to your workplace and make sure that you can support your colleagues in this journey. I think the technology are there, whether it's digital twin, AI, data, and all that, but help our colleagues to be able to be a lot more agile, like with an open mind, be able to see the various data and gauge by themselves, then how do they adapt, right? Because with the innovative mindset and open mindset, I think that's the key to remain resilient. And whether you have different situations, A lot of time it is when few minds come together and think of a better way. You know, before during the COVID at the start, the question about where do we get masks for Singaporean, you know, it is a classic example of coming together. Where do we get? Where are the countries that have? Quick, now go to the supplier there, and whether can you transport it to Singapore? It is about the innovative. You must have the data in hand to know where are your suppliers of producing masks. You must make use of the time zone difference, and you must know where are the shipping lines that can come to Singapore. I think those are classic examples of using many technology to help us to overcome and remain resilient in the time to come.
Thank you so much for that, Kenneth, Dr. Wang, and Peter. It was a great panel. I really enjoyed it. So thank you so much to the panelists, as well as to the audience for joining us today. Now we're having a short coffee break until 3:30 p.m. So do head outside to the exhibition hall or the foyer for snacks, and feel free to ask our panelists or myself any more questions on this topic if you so wish. At 3:30, we'll be having our final panel on the future of predictive analytics in the government in this room. Over in Olivia Room, there'll be a final panel on virtual engagement in the public sector. Thank you so much, and I'll see you all outside. Thank you to our panelists once again.